Release of this series. Just a few words about Extraordinary Canadians. I myself am a huge fan of it. It's going to be a series of 18 books covering the lives of 20 outstanding Canadians. This, of course, are the series editor, Mr. Saul, is here. So, and I remember actually at the last Writers' Fest, Mr. Saul was speaking about how he went to great efforts to match the author with the particular great Canadian that was going to be written about. So maybe I could just start you guys off with, why is it that you think Mr. Saul picked you guys for these two particular great Canadians?
Well, you know, I was in Berlin, and the last thing on my mind was Pearson. But John, who is a friend of mine of many years, had an idea. And actually, he knew that I had a past life in association with Lester Pearson, not the man, but with the historical figure. I personally had written my master's thesis on Lester Pearson in Vietnam and was interested in him, although I had not done I hadn't done a book, and I wasn't a novelist, so I was pleased to be included in this because I'm an observer, but it seems like everyone else is a novelist. But I was delighted to do it, although there were times in Berlin my mind actually, was not on Lester Pearson entirely. But it was a great ride and great fun, and for me, and we'll talk about this, is what I learned about Pearson, and what I learned are the many lives of Pearson. It's not just the image we have of the diplomat, the Prime Minister, many lives, and that was something to talk about.
Well, in fact, when John approached me, Trudeau was in fact at the top of my mind. He figures as a figure in my novel, The Origin of Species, and has a kind of walk-on role, and also figures as an important hero figure for the protagonist there. I'm not actually sure who John may have initially had in mind for Trudeau, but as soon as he brought the subject up, I says, "Well, can I do Trudeau? Has anyone got Trudeau yet?" And he's been very gracious about it. I think he may have been a bit surprised that I so readily gravitated to Trudeau, but because he was someone I was thinking about at the time. I had already been doing research on him for the novel, and someone who had been really, I think, formational for me as a young man, and really was the first Canadian public figure who I identified with in some way. I think John graciously agreed that there was sufficient connection there for me to do Trudeau.
Now, I think we might as well start with Nino. Could you just tease out a couple of points from your book about really what Trudeau did and what we can learn from him in terms of leadership in Canada today?
Well, I think there's some interesting contradictions in Trudeau, both in terms of who he was as a person and how he was perceived, because he was not perceived as a team player, for instance. He was perceived very much as a kind of individualist, someone who went his own way, someone who always stuck to his guns and pursued his ideas, sometimes uncompromisingly. And that was in fact something that appealed to us in him, that he was a kind of original in Canadian politics. He seemed to stand, for instance, in stark contrast to someone like Pearson, who seemed much more the conciliator. And I think that worked to his advantage, because it gave him this kind of star quality, and it gave him this hero quality that people responded to, and that people were really looking for in that era. And I think, particularly among young people, this figure of the role model, of someone who they could be proud of associating themselves with as Canadians, someone who had this very interesting background, for instance, who had studied in interesting places abroad, who had backpacked across the world and subjected himself to all kinds of hardships, who'd been in China during the Revolution, who'd gone to the Soviet Union and been expelled for throwing a snowball at, I believe it was a statue, it could have been a statue of Stalin or Lenin, I can't remember. Lenin's too. And this was something that to a young imagination was very appealing, and then had spent most of the 50s not in politics, but at the political margins, essentially fighting against the establishment through his magazine Cité Libre. Again, that was a point of entry for many young people that they could identify with and see as an appealing pattern for their own lives. So by the time he came into politics, he seemed the outsider. He seemed the person sort of thrust by chance into power and propelled there essentially by the will of the people, as opposed to by the political machinery. And I think that was the aspect of leadership that many people responded to. The fact that he could arise at the right moment and be this strong individual and go his own way and yet get the prize. And yet when you examine the record, there's a lot more careful building that went on behind that, both in terms of his own formation. I mean, the things that he studied were, in fact, things that prepared him very carefully for a leadership position in politics. And even the work in the trenches that he did in the 50s in Quebec were a kind of apprenticeship in understanding the mechanics of politics. And even once he entered politics, he actually had a much more consensual style than I think many people give him credit for, and was. I mean, one of the principles he tried to bring into politics was a greater sense of democracy within the parliamentary system, and to some extent he has succeeded in that. I think prior to him there had been a much more kind of top-down style in cabinet, for instance, where essentially everything went through the prime minister, and ministers sort of formulated their policy and went through the prime minister, and it was usually pushed through. Whereas he made it a requirement that all major policy decisions come to the whole cabinet and be discussed before the whole cabinet and be worked through by everyone before they were presented as policy within individual ministries. So that was certainly a kind of opening up of the process that I think in some ways may have been a bit short-lived. I think we've tended to return to the older model of the top-down kind of leadership. But I think most people wouldn't associate that kind of consensual style with Trudeau, and yet in many instances, not always, but in many instances, that was at the core of his leadership style. He was the kind of person who would sit back and listen to all opinions, and he expected people to be prepared and know what they were talking about and present a strong position. And he would, acquiesce to policies that were argued coarsely, but attack those that weren't. So I think that was a style of leadership that actually was something positive that he brought to Parliament.